Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Now, listen, we want to welcome you all to the Mount Sinai Church for our midweek review. And tonight we are also sharing and streaming live with one of our guests, Reverend Dr. Alyn Waller. And so I'm sure we have also not only some Mount Sinai in the building, but some Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church in the building as well. And it is so good for us to be able to come together and stream tonight for a very important, a critical, and what will be an enlightening and empowering conversation. I am Pastor Corey Johnson of the Mount Sinai Church in Trenton, New Jersey. And it is so good to see you all here tonight. What we are doing is we are going to be holding a critical conversation with three of what I believe some of the most powerful, impactful faith leaders around the country. Many of you all know last week, we had our presidential election. Well, about 2 weeks ago. Seems like it just ended last week. We had a presidential election. Before that, we had a summer of marching. We had a summer of protests. We had a summer of fighting against injustice and systemic oppression. One of the questions that we have to ask ourselves tonight, and that we have to ask ourselves as a church, is this: where do we go from here? How do we not let this movement just be a moment, but how do we let it continue and go on? What do we do now that the election is over? A lot of people were energized. A lot of people were engaged. A lot of people got involved. But what's next? What are we looking for in this next administration? And more specifically, what can the church do as we lead in the fights that are to come? And as we lead in the call for justice and for equality and for freedom and for lightening the load of oppression that our people are facing. And tonight we're gonna have this conversation for the next couple of weeks. And tonight we are starting with three pastors that I love dearly, three pastors that are leaders in their own right. Three pastors that you all know, that many of you all know, and many of you are going to get to know over time. And I'm ready to bring on our panelists right now. I'm ready to bring on our panelists right now. You all can see them right here on your screens. In the top corner, we have Pastor Marcus Larivaux. Pastor Marcus Larivaux is the pastor of the Allon Chapel Seventh-day Adventist Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. Pastor Larivaux has a bachelor's from Oakwood University and a master's in divinity from Emory University's Candler School of Theology. Pastor Larivaux went viral this summer. He is known in the Lincoln community for the protest that he led this summer in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And so we want to welcome Pastor Marcus Larivaux to discussion. We also have Dr. Alyn Waller. Dr. Alyn E. Waller is the senior pastor of the Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Reverend Waller is a well sought after preacher. He is an expert in church growth. He is a leader in the community, and he is a very necessary prophetic voice in this moment. And lastly, we have Pastor Danielle Pilgrim. Pastor Pilgrim is the lead pastor of the New Life Fellowship at Andrews University. Pastor Pilgrim has her master's in divinity from Andrews University, and she is right now working on her PhD in civic engagement and in leadership. And so we want to welcome all three of our pastors. You all, why don't you all help me welcome them to this conversation. I'm going to ask you guys to unmute yourselves as we get ready and as we get going. This is going to be, amen. This is going to be a good discussion. How are you all doing this evening?
Good.
Well, thank you. Pastor Larivaux, we're going to ask you to unmute. There we go. You're in here. All right, guys. Well, we're going to kind of just get started. Yeah, and at the end, we're going to take some questions. We're going to take some questions at the end. Tonight, what we want to talk about is what role does the church play in the continued fight for justice and equality? What role does the church play? What role do pastors play in deciding on, and kind of navigating these new waters? You know, we had a summer where we had a major amount of protests. People marched the streets in the wake of George Floyd. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we go from here? I'm going to start with you, Pastor Pilgrim, and kind of just start us off by kind of telling us, what is the next fight? What is the next thing that the church should get involved in? How do we not let what happened this summer and the engagement that people had in this election, how do we not let it dissipate, but how do we use it to continue to spark more involvement, more engagement?
Yeah, I think the first two ways that we can do that is one, as preachers, we have to continually from our pulpit preach the social justice that we see in the Bible. We have to continue to educate our members on what the gospel talks about with justice. And I think a lot of it is because our church, we don't really have a theology on justice. I'm talking about the Adventist church. We have been giving a certain type of gospel that takes away the plight of certain people. And so we have to continue to preach that. As we preach that, then we have to go into action because we have to be disturbed about what's going on in our community. And so as local churches, we need to fight injustice in our local communities and finding out what areas we as a church can address as a community. We need to be involved in our city council, going to meetings and figuring out ways how we as a church can be a part of bringing justice in those areas. So it's a mixture of preaching social justice, preaching equity, preaching equality, and as well as finding out how can we in our local communities make sure that there are resources and that there's equity happening in our communities.
Dr. Waller, why don't you hop in here? How do we not let this become a moment that dies? How do we keep it going and take it to the next level?
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank both of you for lending your voices to this. I think the role of the church is to help the community ask and answer the question why. You know, Martin Luther King said that riots and uprisings are the voice of the voiceless, the voice of the unheard. Well, we have a voice, and so we have to help people understand the why of the what that is going on. But then also what we have to do is help the community find a safe place to concretize the expectations. You know, when you look at the 60s, in Montgomery, they stopped riding the buses because they wanted changes in the bus company. In Selma, they walked across the bridge because they wanted a particular voting rights legislation. At the March on Washington, they gathered because they wanted a specific civil rights bill. We have a responsibility of concretizing what our wants are. Everybody wants racism to stop. Everybody wants oppression to cease. But the question is, what legislation and what specific things do we want to happen and work for? And the church still, while it may not be at the center of the community like it used to be, it is still well within the circumference. And we who preach the gospel are still among the leaders. And we have the most historical grounding, I think, to help shape the conversation and give it its moral underpinnings.
Pastor Larivaux, hop in here, man. What's your take on this question?
Well, I think that both of you made great points. I think Pastor Pilgrim's point was great, which is to preach on it. And churches move with how the pulpits are led. And if the pastor is not involved, if the pastor doesn't preach about it, if the conversation doesn't start from in the pulpit, oftentimes the conversation will not get started at all. And so I thought that was a great point. Dr. Waller talked about being informed and the history that the Black church has always played in that ending portion of what you were saying. And the Black church historically has always been the place where this can start. I mean, the first acts of rebellion, learning to read, happened in the Black church. Nat Turner was a pastor. Slave rebellion was started in the church. The church definitely has a place and has the responsibility to create new laws and new legislation that says something. I think that it's important for us, as we're having conversation about being informed, that we do not take for granted that we need to make sure that our church is an educational space as well as it is a preaching space and a celebratory space, in the form of book clubs and in the form of having tough conversations with elected officials, having tough conversations about our relationship as the Black church to other churches that have been predominantly white spaces or different types of races and ethnicities, because I think oftentimes we take for granted, because we have the experiential knowledge of what it feels like to experience racism, that it's important that we also have academic knowledge so that we have the ability to have conversation and a baseline of knowledge from which to speak on certain subjects. So here at my church, part of what has been happening is people are saying, Pastor, we see you marching. Pastor, we're marching with you. Pastor, we are using our voice, we're voting, but we want to be able to be as educated as you are on these subjects. And so we've been able to start book clubs, even on Zoom and online platforms, and really educate ourselves with what is going on. Lastly, I think that when it talks about our churches being involved in political affairs, it's important to remember that politics are really boiled down to the things that people really care about. So when we talk about politics, the economy is big, but people really care because they have to put food on their table. When we talk about politics, COVID is big, but people really care because their family members are dying. And so as a church, I think that part of what is important that we do is that we show the people that we care about the issues. And that's why we are saying something about politics. You know, we care about your son that was falsely incarcerated or experienced police brutality. That's why we say something about politics. We care about the fact that people can work 9 to 5, work full time, but minimum wage is so low that you can't afford to put food on the table. We care about those issues. That's why we are involved in politics. And I think that if you can connect people's real life issues to the need for churches to be using their voice to say something politically and to the government, I think that you can really engage the church in that way.
Yeah. One thing that we have learned and we did discover recently in these movements is that, and Doc, I saw you had a conversation this past week with someone where you talked about the decentralization of the Black church when it comes to the marches and to the movements. And I was in another Zoom for a conference I was a part of, and we had to discuss the difference between the civil rights movement and the modern Black Lives Matter movement. What role can the church play in the modern Black Lives Matter movement specifically? What is there a space that the church can kind of etch out? And you kind of played it, so I want you to kind of talk about it more. Is there a space that the church can specifically deal in that other groups have to just say, this is the church's lane? What is our identity in today's movement?
Well, I think there are a couple of places. I think number one, this whole conversation is an economic conversation.
Okay.
Well, not just economics, but it's about economics. The church is one of the landowners in the Black community that we own. So even just the space to have these conversations that we can call our own is the church. And so we own that space and we can invite people into our community. I actually am not afraid of the fact that in this movement, the church doesn't, or the pastor is not the leader just by dint of the fact that he is the pastor. This is a moment that's calling all of us, and particularly you all, that you got to come to the table with more than your title, because it's different. My father's generation were respected just because they were Reverend so-and-so. That is not true today. You will not be respected just because you're Reverend so-and-so. You have to bring something to the table. So I believe that causes us to have to think through who we are and what we are doing. I do believe that every movement needs a spiritual undergirding, because nothing that is just rooted in selfish pride or selfish gain is going to last. And there is a justice, a spiritual truth to justice that we interpret from the church. There is a spiritual reality. There is a holy other that was present in the 60s that will be present now, that leads us to real change and real victory. And we know who that is. And we know the truth of that. And we have the language of that. And in this moment, being decentralized doesn't stop us from speaking that we have to come to the table with our A game. You all will have to have conversations that my father didn't have, and I only had a little bit. And you all will have to wrestle with and bring your best self to the table. And I think that Marcus said something that I agree with. And I want to remind you that in the Black church, if we say it's important, it will show up on Sunday morning in worship. If it does not show up in some way in your worship on Sunday morning, then the Black church is just giving lip service to it. If you say that health is important, somehow you will incorporate health into the morning worship. If we say that Black Lives Matters and social consciousness is important, it'll show up somehow. If we say that children are important, it will show up in the morning worship. If we are guilty of divorcing the issues of the street from our cultic experience, and I mean that in the truest theological sense, then we do the community no justice.
Man, y'all are brilliant, man. Y'all are brilliant. Listen, Danielle, you are on a college campus right now. You work on a college campus. You are leading a fellowship on a college campus. What do you see? And we kind of let's talk about this next generation and the next movement. What are you seeing that young people, millennials, and more specifically Gen Z, how do they repair to the church as a church's relationship, or how do they repair to the church and the church's involvement in the calls for justice and in the calls for equality? What are you seeing from young people on your collegiate campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on this campus, I'm seeing a cry from especially the Gen Z generation for the church to be more involved in justice. And what we're noticing is that they are realizing that there isn't a divorce between theology and justice. They see it as one, right? And it should be as one. And so they are speaking up more in volume these days as it pertains to injustices that they have witnessed with their eyes against Black people. And so there is a desire to be more active, not only on campus, but in their home churches. They're saying, why haven't we had these conversations in our churches? Why hasn't this been preached in our churches? So there's a cry within the millennial and especially the Gen Z generation. And the Gen Z generation, they're more bold. They're bolder than the millennial generation, you know. And so it's just a joy to see that this generation is ready and willing to be armed with tools to attack and address injustice in the community as well as in the church.
Yeah, they are. I mean, and they're radical, man. Like they are next level in terms of leading this fight. Well, I want to transition a little bit, and if you ready to take questions at the end, but I want to transition just a little bit to talking more specifically about the moment that we are living in. As you all know, last week we elected a president-elect. We finished an election, and what you all know and may have seen, and many of you all saw that we saw record turnout, and more people will vote in this election than people have ever voted before. We hit 66% turnout in Philadelphia. I mean, we kind of hit some of the marks that we really wanted to hit when it comes to turnout. One of the issues that we are having, though, and this happened in past administrations, was that you would have president elections where people would turn out in mass force. And then 2 years later, you wouldn't get as much turnout when it came to midterm elections or local elections. And many don't understand how important it is not just to show up and have your voice heard every 4 years, but how important it is to make a culture of voting. How do we, can somebody articulate the importance and kind of stress the need for people staying active and staying engaged when it is not a presidential election, and kind of make the argument for why people need to show up in 2022 and in 2023 and in 2024? Why is it important not just to show up when it's a presidential election, but to show up every time you have an opportunity to vote? Whoever wants to take it, you all can start off.
Well, you know, all politics are local, and while it's exciting to have a presidential conversation, the truth of the matter is most of what you experience in your life does not come down from the president's stuff. Most of what you deal with, meaning the average law that you wrestle with, the average ordinance that you have to deal with is a state or local thing. The president and the Republicans showed you what they really wanted was judges. What you will probably not meet Joe Biden, but you will probably have to have a judge do something with your life. Now, that doesn't mean, and remember this, it doesn't mean that you're going to go to court for something. Judges do more than just try cases. And so judges are important. And that's all the Republican Party wanted out of Trump. They wanted him to make enough noise so that they can fill the federal courts with far right-wing judges. And they did that. While he made noise and we followed him in his noise, they threw hundreds, not just that that Supreme Court, but the other federal courts. What you and I must recognize is that this is really a ground game, and we have to stay involved, because in 6 months here in Philadelphia, every 6 months, there's an election, and we will be dealing with the DA, and we will be dealing with judges. And those are the bread and butter issues that affect us every day. And I think we have to, in the church, we have to teach civics. We have to help people understand. And we have to remind people that Jesus's birth was a political statement by God, that I am God and Caesar is not. And so then, and when you understand who Jesus is fully, everything he did was a political statement. So you don't have to run in your pulpit away from it. And that has nothing to do with campaign politics. I don't believe, I don't have politicians in my pulpit and Sunday morning stuff. There's a way to do this and keep the gospel, and keep the worship experience, but be totally prophetic in the moment. So I think reminding people that the everyday stuff of your life doesn't necessarily come down from the president. It comes from the mayor, it comes from city council, from the judges in your local community. And you have to get involved. Whether your streets get cleaned and your snow gets removed has as much to do with your voter turnout percentage as it does who is in office.
Listen, we're gonna talk more about that. Pastor Larivaux, hop in here, man.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Doc. I'm just thinking about the theology. It's, Jesus' first act was political. His first act was to the government. From the moment he was born, the government was so afraid they were killing babies everywhere. But we talked about the church having a prophetic voice. There is no prophetic scripture in all of the Bible that does not involve some type of speaking to somebody's government somewhere. So it's important that the church, our church is our voice in this way. I absolutely agree with you. I also agree that it's important that while we may not be political and may not have elected officials campaigning in our pulpit, it's important that we encourage our members to know who the elected officials are, that they know who represents them in their districts, that they know when the elections are coming up, And that's something that I push really hard. Whenever it's voting time, whenever we're voting for anything in the city or in the state, I make sure that the members know that it's important that the members are registered to vote, and we register people to vote to make sure that they know when things are happening in their community. They know who their elected officials are. They know what they stand for, and when they make mistakes, we are also unafraid to hold them accountable. That we will have a press release, that we will put out a statement in the paper, or have a press conference and invite the news to be there, that we will make sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable. And I think that by doing that as leaders, by encouraging our churches to do this, they know when elections are coming up. They know when it's time to vote people into office. They also know and can then create an environment for new elected officials to be born. Dr. Waller, I don't know if you remember this, but maybe some 6-7 years ago, you preached a sermon, "Can Philadelphia Create a Barack Obama?" And that sermon was really powerful to me. 7 years later, I still remember it, because it's important that we don't just view ourselves as holding elected officials accountable, but the next elected official can be sitting in our congregation. And if we don't teach our young people about political involvement, civic engagement, if we are not letting them know from an early age about their responsibilities and their duties, so that when they're old enough to register to vote, they can. If we don't let people know that this is a possibility, that the responsibility of this country is for people to run for office and to care about the issues of our time and our day, to be civically involved. If we don't do that from the pulpit, then it will never happen. So it's important that we get people involved in these other elections, because this really is us.
Sorry, I was enjoying too much discussion. I just muted myself. Pastor Pilgrim, in here.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in. I agree with all that has been said. Corey, I think the reality is that people need to be educated on the importance of midterm elections. And Nancy Pelosi and the House, they won the House because of the midterm elections. It was a suburban revolt against the Trump administration that caused the House to be Democratic, right? And so it is important for people to know, like, that midterm elections affect, as Dr. Wallace said, the day-to-day life of people more than the president himself. And it's important that if we have a president in office who has stated that they will do things, especially for the African American community, that he needs a Congress that will support him in making these laws come to pass. So it's important that we educate our members on the importance of making these elections. And then when you come down to the local level, governors, every midterm election, you have about 37 governors who will be elected. We had, when I was in Atlanta, it was Brian Kemp and Stacey Adams, and we had that big fight there. You want people in power who are going to be creating policies that are for the benefit of the people. The reason why we have all these injustice and racial inequities in our society is because it's attached to policies. Every issue that you have in your community is attached to a policy. And what we need to realize is that there are people in power who are creating these policies, whether they're good or bad. And so you have to make sure you're electing people who are creating policies that is for the benefit of your people. In Atlanta, I was serving at a church, a very upper middle class church, yet the community that we sat in was a very low class community. The community has a food desert. The schools are lacking resources. How can we sit in that church, praise our God, when the people are languishing and all we care about is their spiritual vitality, their spiritual health? The gospel is twofold. And I think it's important that we know when the Bible talks about the kingdom of God. And every time God, he healed someone or he performed a miracle, he said, the kingdom of God has come upon you. We have to remember, the kingdom of God is twofold. It's one, also the kingdom to come, but the kingdom is here right now. And when we vote, when we stand up for justice, when we put the right people in office, when we hold politicians accountable, that is also building up the kingdom of God. And so I think it's important for people to know, like, midterm election is important. And that's a part of us building up the kingdom of God, because the people that we put in place make policies that affect the lives of people. And when we address those issues, we're building up the kingdom of God.
You know, I want you guys to kind of talk to some of the conversation. This is good conversation. I mean, I'm learning from you three brilliant pastors and preachers. But I want you to talk to some young person or some person who's watching who says it's all crooked. No one really cares about us as Black people. They all make these promises. They come around every few years, and I get it. Voting, it matters. Y'all keep telling me it matters, but my community looks the same, and my it hasn't changed. And I want you to kind of talk to those who are disillusioned towards the idea of just engaging in the process anymore, or somebody who's fed up or tired, and they're just saying, I don't even want to vote. I don't want to show up. I just want to just march on the streets. I just want to protest, but I don't even want to hope from those promise makers anymore. What would you say to them? Because that is a growing sentiment I've heard in younger generations, especially as in Black young people, is that they're all crooked. They don't really care about us. They're just making empty promises. What would you say to them beyond just vote, but specifically as leaders? What would you say to them?
Can I give a personal experience?
Please, yeah.
Okay, so for me, as you know, I'm an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, right? And I was an undocumented immigrant for many years in this country. And not until President Barack Obama came into power and he signed an executive order that allowed me and 800,000 other undocumented immigrants to be able to work legally in this country, right? I am here as a result of a politician who made a promise and it happened. And I am here now reaping the benefits of that policy and that law that he created. Then you had another politician who came into power who wanted to rescind everything that Obama did. And so my life was in jeopardy. But then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. And so I'm here as a witness that it works. It works. And in some ways it doesn't work. Some ways there is corruption, but a lot of times it works. But you have to have the right people in the right place to make the decisions that affect the lives. And so I'm a witness that it works.
I mean, that's a powerful. How can you follow that up? I mean, that's such a. That's right. Drop the mic. That's such a powerful testimony. I mean, I can't follow it up like that. But my encouragement is, if you feel like the elected officials are not doing anything and no changes are really being made, run. You be the change. Let's not just talk about what the problems are. Let's be a part of the solution. And even if you personally doesn't run, let's organize ourselves together to see who it is that can run and who it is that can take, because there's someone in the community that can represent the community. And if the community as a whole feels like change isn't being made, it's representative government. Find someone who can represent you and then gather the community together to vote them into office so that change can then be made in your community. Don't allow people to run in your from your district, from your community, that will not adequately represent you in the ways that you, or for the changes that you are looking to happen. So if you feel disillusioned with the process, become a part of the process.
I like that.
I really appreciate that, because number one, I do think we have to acknowledge the sentiment and name it as true. You know, politics is the business of compromise, and lots of people who get involved in that find, I mean, there's a lot of compromises, a lot of mendacity, a lot of hypocrisy. So I think we have to name it as true, but then we also have to remind them that the way it really works is, once somebody's in office, you have to make them do what you want. So if you're not involved, no, you're right. They're not going to do anything for you. They're going to do for the person who makes them do. So getting people involved, and remember that, I think we need to remember that Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris is going to do anything for the community just because they're there. We have to now stay engaged, and stay engaged, as Marcus has talked about. You know, it's representative. And so then you as an individual need to become a part of a group that then is a part of a movement that then impacts and presses upon those who are in office. There's a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, and it's a wonderful book that I think people need to read. And he looks at the fall of American community, and he argues, now it was written before a lot of this Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, but he was sort of pointing out how people don't volunteer anymore and people don't get involved, and that was a problem of America. In order for America to work, you as an individual must connect with your own personal cause, and you have to connect with other people who share your passion, and you all need to work on it for the community. America does not work for you if you sit down and do nothing.
Doc, you said be a part of a group and a large group. Well, can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah. So let me help you with that. So for me, my passion and how I'm going to serve America is through the church. I am a pastor. I am going to lead a church, and I am going to lead the church in issues of justice for my people. That's my avenue. Everybody may not do that, but there are other groups. There are sororities and fraternities and lodges and clubs and organizations and associations, but everybody needs to find sort of that grounding out of which they work, out of which they find meaning for their own personal lives and development, and they group with other people and work collectively on an issue in society. We don't all have to work on the same issue, and the issues are myriad, but everybody has to get involved and work with others towards that. You know, I like the language, a more perfect union. That is not a perfect union, but it can be more perfect. And that's what we're working for. And each generation pushes it closer to it. So as my father, I'm fourth generation. And now that you married in, you make the fifth generations of preachers in this line, Corey. And so our generation of preachers begins as slave preachers. And each generation, my grandfather did not go to school, couldn't write his name. My father graduated with a master's degree. I got a doctorate. You in trouble, boy. You better keep moving. And so, you know, every generation is supposed to push this thing forward until we get there.
You know, this is a good discussion because you have so many different vantage points involved. You know, we got three preachers. You know, one is saying, you know, I was a DACA recipient. I believe Danielle, you were saying, you know, I was, but it was actual politics that helped me. It was someone in an elected office who kept a promise. And Doc and Marcus, you're like, and I'm gonna get to you a second, Marcus. I want you to talk about something. But Doc, you're like, you know, it was a legacy of speaking truth to power that has informed you and guided you to this place. Marcus, for you, you know, this summer, and many people don't know, and I'll probably try to post it on the church's page today. You went viral this summer in a speech that you gave as the pastor of Allon Chapel in Lincoln. You did this in Lincoln, Nebraska. Black man going to city council and reading them to filth, man. I mean, you were preaching in that city council meeting. Can you just talk about that experience, the content, and what was the reaction? Just talk about that a little bit for those who are watching. And what was the reaction to the speech that you gave this summer in the height of the Black of the social justice movement that took place in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Well, we're talking about if you see a problem, get in. If you see the problem, get involved. If you see that there's something going on, if you're tired of the way things have been, then you ought to do something. And so for us here in Lincoln, there was a lot going on, and we saw a lot of the same things that we saw around the country. Now, for context, Lincoln is a city of about 300,000 people. So it is a mid-sized American city, but it's a major city. It's the capital of Nebraska. But there's only 10,000 Black people here, some 4% or something like that. Yet and still, we still see Black people being racially profiled. We still see police brutality. We still see a lot of the same issues. We still saw protesters of color being attacked for no reason at all whatsoever, on camera, on the news. And so something had to be said, something had to be done. I had multiple opportunities to go speak to both city council and to go speak to the state legislature, the state senators. And I think that the reason why things were so viral and things were so popular was because the conversation, the discussion was honest and it was transparent, and we were bold enough to tell the truth. And that's just so important. And it's so important that when we see a problem, like we said, we don't just sit on the sidelines, but we go and we speak truth to power. Because of that, what was able to happen was I was able to build relationships with my state representative. I was able to build relationships with my city council representative. I can call them on the phone or send them an email. They email me or call me to ask me about different legislation that they are doing, or ask me if I will help to participate in the creation of legislation. And the reason is because they understand that I pastor a church with a lot of people, or enough people to make a difference, right? It's because they have to now respect the voice, because they understand if they do not represent the people that they are called to represent appropriately and adequately, then there will be, as we say, consequences and repercussions. Like it is. We have now built the relationship in such a way that we have called them to the table. And like Dr. Waller said, we have let them know that you have to represent us, because that's the way this government is set up, and that's the way our country is built. The more those views went up, the more they're like, okay, well, if people are going to have something to say, then we better be listening.
Listen, and I'm glad you said that. The reason why I wanted to go there to transition to our next topic, we have about 10 to 15 minutes left before we end, and we're going to take a couple of minutes for questions at the end. But I'm glad you brought that up, Pastor Larivaux, Marcus, because we want to talk about the managing of the power that we have as pastors. For example, you talked about the relationship that you now have with elected officials. But one of the tensions there is that at some point, as a pastor and as a preacher, as a Black preacher, there is going to be a moment where you're going to have to stand and speak truth to power, and speak truth to elected and political power. Many of you all know we're going to have a runoff in Georgia for 2 Senate seats. Marcus, you and Danielle both pastored in Georgia. You know that state well. And one of the people that are running for a Senate seat is Reverend Raphael Warnock, the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. This
he was
week,
in seminary.
Exactly. Yeah, when he was professor in seminary. And this week, a series of attack ads have come out against Reverend Warnock, featuring his preaching. A clip showed him saying, "You can't serve both God and the military. You can't serve both God and money." But they spliced it just to take that out to say he's an anti-American preacher. They also put out an attack ad saying that he defended and that he was in relationship with Obama's pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, and they've been using that to attack him, even as he's running for public office. And I bring that up to ask this question. I want you guys to speak to: how do we manage both being politically engaged while maintaining our prophetic voice and our prophetic standing? How do we manage getting involved and make sure that people vote, make sure that people vote for good elected officials and good presidents, while also maintaining enough independence to be able to full voice speak truth to power? And how do we work through that tension? I'm gonna throw that out there. Whoever wants to take it, you all can run with it, and we can let the discussion go from there.
Yeah, can I respond to that? I want to start with having a conversation with the church first. I think that oftentimes when we have this conversation, that the church can sometimes be critical of pastors who are civically engaged and who speak about political issues. And I think that oftentimes what has happened in the church, what has happened in the like what we now refer to as the evangelical right side of the church, is that there should be the language is that there should be a separation of church and state, and that churches should and pastors should not get involved in these issues and shouldn't be speaking to the government in this way. I think that it's important that we think about separation in church and state and what it was born to be. This phrase is Jeffersonian language, and it's a fundamental tenet of Jeffersonian democracy. Like Thomas Jefferson used this phrase, and it was a paraphrase from the First Amendment, which is to say that we are protected as the church from the government. The First Amendment is like, we have the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, and freedom of religion. So separation of church and state is a protection for the church from the government. But it does not say that the government is protected from the church, right? The government cannot critique the church, but the church is free and protected by the Constitution to critique the government. It's not two ways. So the church has that freedom to use its voice, has that freedom to correct the government and critique the government, to be critical of the government, as we are participating in our American duty and responsibility to fight for that more perfect union. For the church to critique the government is inherently American. So it's important that churches and pastors are using their voices in that way to make a difference. I also remember when Jeremiah Wright first got in trouble in 2007, 2008, when Obama was running for the first time. Jeremiah Wright was on the news, and they were asking him all these questions about all the comments that he made in the clip that they kept playing about, goddamn America. And he was saying that this is part of Black liberation theology. And I remember there was this one interview where he was asking, have you read James Cone? Have you read James Cone? Have you read James Cone? And they never answered the question because, of course, they had never read James Cone. They didn't know much about Black liberation theology. And so for us as a church people, one more time as a statement to the church, it is important that we remember how I first started when we had this conversation, which is to say it's important that our churches are informed about what it is we mean when we talk about what we're talking about. Like, it's important that we talk to our churches about Black liberation theology. It's important that we talk to our churches about what it means to critique the government. It's important that we are well read, that we are reading James Cone, so that when these ads come on, that they are not persuaded by the way that the clips are spliced and things are taken out of context. And they can also have conversations with other voters to say, no, they are lying. They're trying to make him look bad. That they are now informed voters from a political perspective and from a theological perspective.
I agree with Marcus. One of the indictments on our own community was that when Jeremiah Wright was being, and they spent $7 million on attacking Jeremiah Wright because they were going after him. Now, Jeremiah Wright and Warnock happen to be friends of mine. I refer to Jeremiah Wright as Daddy J. The reality is I'm influenced by Jeremiah Wright. The indictment on our community is that there were as many black people who had never heard of James Cone as there were white. There were many black people who did not know about liberation theology and black theology, and which caused a problem. What we have to accept is to be, Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own home. If you're going to be a prophet, you're going to get in trouble. That's just real. If you're going to speak truth to power. Now, what you and I have to make sure we do is that we hold our integrity, meaning don't use language you don't personally understand or believe. And number two, be willing to speak truth even when it hits home. One of the challenges that you're going to face, particularly with your generation, is yes, the easy part of being prophetic is calling white people out for their racism. Who can't find white racism? The easy part of, finding a black in the Bible, that's not hard. Show me a white person in the Bible. The easy part is pointing out is racism, mendacity, and hypocrisy in white folk. The hard part of being prophetic is when you have to turn to your own people and address the internalized oppression that informs their behavior that does not change. And that's the part. And the way you keep your integrity in the whole conversation is that people see that you will have as much full throat with white folk, but you'll also have full throat when your own community needs to hear it. And I think that when you have that level of balance in your voice, people will be able to come away from you saying, I don't like what he said, but I respect who he is. Or she. Yes. Blame my gray hair.
No, I think Doc wrapped it up really well, because I was going to say that, to speak prophetically is to talk about the will and the purpose of God as it pertains to the world. And no matter who's on the spectrum that you're attacking, like, you have to speak true to power, to whether it's even to the church that you're calling out. And I think within our Adventist church, one of the issues that we have is, and the reason why we're so late to the movement of justice, of social justice, is because we have been taught and we have been given this Eurocentric theology that came down from a seat of privilege. And so we're so late to addressing social issues because of the theology that we've been given. And we have to address that as well. We have to speak truth to power to, our institution that has taught, that did not teach us James Cone and liberation theology. We have to speak the same way we're speaking out against, politicians who do wrong by our people. It's the same way we have to speak against the church. And when we only preach a certain type of gospel. So I think he's absolutely correct. We have to be have integrity on all sides of the spectrum and speak against erroneous beliefs and erroneous beliefs and theologies all across the board. So I think it's really important that we really be mindful that we just have to be consistent across the board. That's what I'm trying to say.
This was an enriching conversation, I think, for a lot of people, because many people were asking, okay, what do we do now? What's next? What should we be looking out for now? The elections are over. As we're beginning to wrap up, the elections are over. We still got the same issues in our community. We have a new president coming in. What's if you were to say, this the next thing that you should be looking forward to, that you should be doing, what would you all say that is? I'm gonna give you a second to think about that. But and I say that because it might be you may need to read something or prepare for this, or or you may be corporate as a community. We need to call the next presidential administration to do this. But if somebody said, the summer is over, people aren't really in the streets anymore, Trump at some point is going to leave the White House, kind of feels like, what do we do next? With all we've talked about today, what would you all say if somebody's watching tonight and saying, what should we do now? What would you tell them?
Well, I would suggest.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Well, bottom line, I think number one, you've got to connect with your own personal passion. You have to find where your passion intersects with the group that makes sense to you, and that you got to get involved in the issue that you have passion around in your community. All politics are local. Find your personal passion. Get involved, find the group that shares that passion and get involved on that issue in your community and keep pressing it. I know that sounds simple and sophomore, but if everybody does that, then we chip away at this thing in a corporate way and in a larger way. At the end of the day, a lot of this boils down to economics. Even Martin Luther King said, and this is why they shot him. They didn't shoot him over schools and all that. They shot him because he started saying to America, it's time to share the pie. It's time to share the money. And now we need to press this administration about the flow of money. Here in Philadelphia, one of the poorest and richest cities in the country. I mean, on the one hand, we're the poorest large black city, but on the other hand, we've got $2 billion worth of construction going on all over the city. We've got to begin to ask the question, how come the money does not flow in such a way that we can have 10 black businesses with $25 million of assets or more? And we've got to start pressing the city, not city council, but the Chamber of Commerce to ask, how can you function in such a way that in the next 5 years, Philadelphia produces 10 vibrant black businesses that have assets of 25 million or more? I mean, put some concrete pieces on the table and begin to push it. Those of us who are in a season where we have seats at the table have to risk our reputation to press for our people so that the sounds of the street are also heard and echoed by the people in the seats.
I'm gonna move on to Marcus next, but I want you to kind of speak to the sound of the streets are echoed by the people of the seats. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is if somebody is in the street and they are talking about wages, or they are talking about livable wages, or they are talking about schools without asbestos, and they are doing whatever they're doing, then those of us who have gotten to a point where when the meetings happen, we're in there. We don't need to act as if we don't know what the street is talking about. The people at the table need to perceive that they probably ought to listen to me, because me and the people in the street are saying the same thing. And we can't be afraid. Those of us who get here can't be afraid to stay connected. And I think that's an issue that we have to speak to, because, the civil rights movement, you need Malcolm, you need Martin, but you need Abernathy, but you also need Powell. You need Adam Clayton Powell in there writing the stuff. You need all of this to work. And so we need to march, but we also need people who are in office, and we also need people who are at the door negotiating and at the table negotiating. And all of us need to have that scarlet thread of prophetic redemptive work and be able to interpret each other.
Amen. Marcus, go ahead. You next.
Yeah, that was great. If the question is, now that the vote is over, what can we do? Oh, well, I actually want to take a step back. Now that the vote is over is a huge deal. And I think that there is room to not gloss over that, but for us to pat ourselves on the back and say that we did turn out in record numbers, that we were able to vote Trump out of the White House, that our vote did matter, and we did the work. We did it. We were organized. We did it in advance with all the early voting. We had voting plans and registered people at record numbers. That's a big deal. And part of the reason why I want us to acknowledge that is because in acknowledging it, we can also begin the initial steps of being able to replicate it. We don't want this to be the only time that this happens, but we want to be able to replicate this process so that in the midterm elections, we could do it again. And 4 years from now, we could do it again. And we can make this part of what we do as church people, as Black people, and as American people. And then as we move forward, like Doc says, we learn to move in our passions. We find the things that are important to us, and we fight for those things. This year, this summer, we made police reform such a big deal. Let's not lose that momentum. This is important because a lot of the change that will happen in police reform will happen on a state level. And that's local politics. It's important that we continue to have conversations with our state legislator. That it's important that we continue to talk to our state attorney. And it's important that we are part of the conversation as legislation is moved forward, and that we continue to put the pedal to the metal so that they care enough to make a difference. If it's me, we tie the issues of police brutality and the need for police reform to the need for reform in our incarceration system. I contextualize everything. So here in the state of Nebraska, Nebraska is a majority, overwhelmingly white state. However, Black people still fill up the prisons, overwhelming majority. Why is that the case? Why is it that the case that Black people are still over-policed in our city, over-policed in our state? Something has to be done. It is incumbent upon us not to rest while we have made progress, but continue to fight so that more progress can be made as we move forward, and progress can be made at local city levels and local county and state levels as well. And then also make sure that whatever happens as we move forward in COVID, that Black people are not lost in what is going on. And Black people have had a very tumultuous relationship with the American healthcare system. So it's important that we are informed. It's important that we are not left at the back of the line or left getting the short end of the stick. I know that people have fears about the vaccine, and just fears because of things that I know Black folk aren't ready to go nowhere near the government needles. But that's a conversation we have to have. And that's part of our fight for justice as well. Also making sure that Black people don't end up at the back of the line if and when the vaccine comes out, so that all other communities end up healthy, and our children and our grandparents and our community don't end up dying while other communities are thriving because governmental officials have not prioritized our communities. So that to me is a really pressing issue, something that we can continue to fight for as we move forward.
Danielle, something that you would say, somebody's like, where do we go from here? What do we do next? What would you say?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what Dr. Waller and Marcus have already stated, but one of the things I would like to add is on the church level that, the local politics is as more important in my mind than higher. So if you are on a local level, what can I do to ensure that my community the issues in my community are being addressed. And if I'm talking to an individual, how can I align myself with an organization that helps, that assists, that pushes our local government to make changes that are needed? If I'm talking to a church or a pastor, how can I make sure that my church is literate about the things that are going on in my community? And then once we're literate on those issues, then we have to speak up and go to city council meetings and talk to our mayor and be a part of where decisions are being made, so that I can address, the church can address these issues. So it depends on where you are on the spectrum. But the key thing is, one, to be literate. Then the second is to align yourselves with people of power so that you can be a part of change. And then third, we have to just, the phrase is said, make good, be a part of good trouble. And in order to do that, you really have to be well versed on the issues, so then you could address it. And so I think education is key, aligning yourself with organizations and with people who are in power, so that you can speak up on behalf of that. And then keep politicians accountable to what they said they will do. The Biden campaign has Lift Every Voice project for Black communities. The Lift Every Voice Biden plan for Black America. He states that he wants to decrease the wealth gap between Black America and white America. He states that he wants to make sure that African American churches who are affected by COVID receive extra funding so that they can keep their church doors open. In that Biden plan, there are so many things that we've laid out for Black America, but it won't happen if we don't keep them accountable. And so accountability is everything. Those who are in power, we the people, have to keep them accountable to what they've said that they will do. And so we are aware of these things.
And I do want to I know you're getting ready to close up, and I just wanted to just sort of say this. It'll sound churchy, but we're all pastors. I hope that you all won't forget that our power is in that we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and that we love people. That's our currency. The degree to which people perceive that you, Marcus, you, Danielle, you, Corey, me, Alyn, that we preach the gospel and that we really love people. Power is a trust. And when people trust you, they give you that power. And when you have that power, you can then use it for the people. And when God sees that you use that power for the people, then God also gives you his power. And that makes a difference. That's what makes us different than the president of OIC or that the president of, and all of these are wonderful, but don't forget, you all are pastors and we're blessed to be so. God didn't have to do it. And it's not because we're perfect or anything like that. God just decided, I'm going to call you. And I think we have to keep that in mind. It blows my mind every day I wake up that God would call me with all that I'm not and with all that I can't do. But God just decided, you know what, I'm going to use you this way. And I think we ought all keep that in mind, because that's where the power comes from.
Power is a trust. Yeah. I'm gonna sit with that. Listen, I'm gonna ask you to close us out with prayer. But before we do that, so I'm gonna ask you to go last with this final question. There's somebody watching and they're like, listen, I didn't go to seminary. I don't know. You're talking about liberation theology, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind around being socially and civically engaged as a believer. What can I read? Is there a book that you guys would recommend that has helped you on your journey, or something you're saying, hey guys, just check this out, read this. For me, it was The Cross and the Lynching Tree. That blessed me, that kind of awakened something within me. We all have that piece of literature, or something that kind of gives a voice to movements. But I'm gonna ask you to go first, Danielle, and then Marcus, and the doc. I'm gonna ask you to go last, and then I'm gonna ask you to pray us out. But there's somebody watching. They're like, listen, I want to kind of begin to think in terms of justice. I want to know what I should add to my library, what I should be reading as a civically and socially engaged believer. Danielle, can you think of something a book that you would recommend for people to add to their library?
Sure. I think one would be Black Liberation Theology by James Cone. And I think the second one would definitely be Jesus and the Disinherited. And I think that's by Howard Thurman. And that one is definitely a necessity. When you look at the Bible and realize how much Jesus aligns himself with those who are marginalized and is passionate for those who are on the sidelines. It's really a key book.
Marcus.
Yes, Jesus and the Disinherited. That's a great book. I have some of my books behind me. When you asked, I almost tore down this whole bookshelf, but I got two here. One, I think there's nothing more important than knowing your history, knowing where you come from, knowing the legacy that has been left before you, for you to then take the mantle and move forward. This book, Liberating Black Church History, powerful, life-changing. It's a comprehensive look at the interaction of Black people with Christianity in these Americas. It's written by Dr. Juan Floyd Thomas, the great historian from Vanderbilt University. He teaches at their seminary there. Wonderful, wonderful book from a wonderful man. And then also A Black Theology of Liberation, James Cone. This is the manual. To me, there is no place to start better than A Black Theology of Liberation by James Cone. It is his seminal work, and he is the father of Black liberation theology. And so this, I would recommend to anyone as the place to start if you're looking for a structural theological language from Black perspective. This is the book for you.
Excellent.
But I do want to also say, as you're reading this book, you don't have to do it alone. Start a book club, get some of your friends, get some of your church members, invite, if you're a pastor, get some other pastors, or however you want to do it. Have these conversations in community so that we can all continue to grow together.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And the book that I would suggest is actually by the pastor that we've talked about tonight, Raphael Warnock. Raphael Warnock has written a wonderful book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church. I was given the book. I read it in a day. It was so gripping. He talks about 5 moments in the Black church history. He argues that the Black church was born out of the abolitionist and out of the revivalist traditions of religion in America. And because of those two traditions, there's always been sort of a struggle between saving Black bodies and saving Black souls. And we always see it in the church. Some churches are high worship and low social consciousness. Other churches are high social consciousness and boring worship. And he calls that the divided mind. So he looks at these moments in the church, the moment of the creation of the church, the institutionalization of the church, the conscientizing of the church, Martin King reminding the Black church what it should be, the theologizing of the church, and that's James Cone giving language to what we've always been. And then he calls for a 5th moment, the synthesizing. And that 5th moment is really your moment. You know, I grew up in a time when the academy fought the church. You know, James Cone, my parents would have struggled with Cone. And James Cone, and even to a certain degree, Eddie Glaude would raise, "Is the Black church dead?" And, you know, when he wrote that, I sent him a binder full of stuff from Enon saying, "Hell no, we ain't dead." But your generation is going to synthesize this to where the Black Academy is not going to fight the Black church. Because if the godless academy will ever hook up with the ignorant church, we might have some Christian babies. And that's the challenge. And that's what Warnock calls for in the synthesizing moment. And I believe that's going to be your generation that's going to actually synthesize this thing so that we're thinking our faith with Jesus is in truth. And so I'll close with that. Thank you so much for letting me hang out with y'all. And thank you for letting me feel like the next generation is going to be all right.
Listen,
So
let me go back before you pray. Listen,
Okay,
I want to thank you all for serving on this discussion tonight. We've had an awesome time. This is presented by the Mount Sinai Social Justice Ministry, and we're happy to have my brothers and sisters from the Enon Baptist Church with us tonight. I want to thank Pastor Larivaux and the family from Allon Chapel, Pastor Pilgrim from Andrews University. We thank you all just for the information we have. We do have a work ahead of us. And so I'm excited for the future. I'm excited to hit the ground running. Dr. Waller, why don't you pray us out as we close?
All right. Thank you. Come on. God, we bless you and thank you. We thank you for calling us into ministry. We thank you for giving us a place to serve. Thank you, God, for a riveting conversation that crosses the generation, crosses gender, and that challenges us to think about Stony the road we've trod and challenges us to think about the promised land that is yet ahead. Lord, help us to find our full-throated voice that we might speak for you and might lift our people. Now, God, as we get ready to leave this place, but never from your saving grace, Lord, give us traveling grace till we meet again. We ask it through Christ, and for his sake we do pray. Let us all say,